Pre-calls. It's a common question we get from guests. Why do I have to go to them? Why do we have them? See, not every podcast host does them, but it's a great opportunity for the guest to show up and shine and make the best out of this opportunity. So right now, Chloe and Louise are going to dig into a little bit more of what a pre-call is, how to prepare for them, and how to make the most out of every opportunity.
Thanks so much, Tom. And thank you so much for joining me, Louise. I'm so excited to talk about pre-calls with you today.
I'm looking forward to it too.
Perfect. So to top us off, can you explain what a pre-call is in the context of podcast interviewing?
So a pre-call is when a host requests that their guest meets with them in advance of the actual interview recording. So this can be either a week before, a couple of hours before. Sometimes they like to push it that little bit further out as well. It's really good for making sure that the host and the guest are really prepared for their interview and setting them up for success.
Okay, so you would say it's important for the host and the guest both?
For some hosts, it's very, very important. It helps them with their organization. It helps them gather the bits of information that they need before the interview. And for some guests, it can really put their mind at ease, especially if they're unsure about what topic they want to cover during the interview. But not every host does it. It really depends on the host and their kind of level of comfortability and what they want to do.
And I would say it's definitely important for the guests too, because especially for our clients who are new to podcasting, having a pre-call usually is a nice way to ease into the process. So what about beyond even just preparation, what about setting the tone for pre-calls too? Because I've had clients where they've had hosts who really want to nail down exactly like the vibe of the show they're trying to get. I know vibe doesn't mean anything, but
yeah, but you're right. It can really set the tone. Some hosts you'll find they're more kind of conversational. Some are a bit more formal. Some would prefer the interview to be more like a chat amongst friends. And if you haven't met each other before, you might admire each other, but that doesn't mean that you've had a conversation. So it can break that kind of cold calling feeling, and it can really set up the beginnings of a friendship or collaboration together. And everybody will feel like the listeners will get the benefit of that bit of knowledge between each other and knowing what kind of direction the call is going to go as well, the interview.
I love that. So in your professional opinion, because you are quite the professional, what do you think is the most important stuff that should be discussed on pre-calls? What are the key elements?
So aside from your finding out what time and date you want to have the full interview, I think the most important things that should be discussed on a pre-call are what kind of topics you want to go talk about. You've also got what kind of topics you don't want to cover. That can be equally as important. As like we know, our guests are experts in their field, but we want to make sure that the interview is going in the direction where nobody is left feeling uncomfortable or they don't know what is going on. There is nothing worse than being stuck on camera and having a question put in front of you that you're like, oh, I know nothing about this. I can't answer this at all. So it really helps with making sure that everybody knows the direction that they want the conversation to go.
Perfect. Makes sense. And how long would you say a typical pre-call lasts in your professional experience?
So I've had hosts that want pre-calls that are quite lengthy. I mean, over an hour, that's a lot in my opinion, but normally 15 to 20 minutes is perfect. You get on, you get everybody set up, you make sure everybody sounds good, they look good, and your 15 to 20 minutes should be enough to discuss what kind of topics. If you talk too much on a pre-call, you can almost lose the naturalness of the conversation, and it can feel a bit rehearsed.
It's funny too, because I've also had clients where they go in for the pre-call and they hit it off with the host so well that they just go into the full interview while they're doing it. So sometimes a pre-call, some magic can happen there too with content. So what are some common mistakes that people make during a pre-call, either the host or the guest?
As far as the guest is concerned, let's be fair, podcast interview marketing is exactly that. It's the the guest is going on because they want to set themselves up as a thought leader, but they're selling themselves. They're selling their business, their brand. Um, but that can be a total like mood killer if you go into a pre-call and you're really salesy about yourself. You want to go in humble. You want to go in with the idea that this interview is a conversation. It's not a sales pitch. It's not an advert. Um, if you go in too salesy about yourself, you're going to put the podcast host off. They possibly would even retract their invitation. So you want to be very careful about that. As a host, then, yes, you're excited. Yes, you want to talk to this guest, but you don't want to come across as like that overbearing or almost too rigid. You start that conversation going, get that flow. And yeah, you also want to make sure that you're showing up looking professional to the pre-call, because if you don't, then it gives off the wrong impression altogether.
Going back to what you said about the being too salesy and like maybe a host is a little too rigid, the rigidity. So I think there's a really fine line to walk when it comes to pre-calling, because you do want to be professional, but you don't want to be, again, too salesy or too rigid. So how does a pre-call help build rapport between the podcast host and the guest? Because I think rapport is kind of where that fine line shoots right through.
Yeah, you go in humble. So like you're a guest. The clue is in the title. You're a guest on their show. It's like calling over to somebody's house. You don't want to like walk in and be like, well, this is how we're doing it and I want to do it this way. And go in, ask what you can give or what would be valuable for their listeners to hear. So you want to make sure that you're providing value to their listeners, who are, if we've done our job right, who are your target audience, and they're exactly who you want to talk to. But the host will know their listeners better than you will. So you want to make sure that you're giving the listeners what they want via the host's platform.
And so this is actually very topical to something you and I experienced just 10 minutes ago. Pre-calls are also very important for nailing down the technical aspect of recording podcasts. So what role does a pre-call play there?
As you said, we had our own little technical hiccup. Apparently, I've forgotten to turn my mic on. There's a power button. So yeah, it's really important to make sure that like you've got the sounds working right. Like you want to make sure that you're going into that interview not panicking that you don't sound good, that your background looks cluttered and chaos and messy. Because more interviews are recorded with video nowadays. So you want to make sure that everything is organized, or it's branded, or it's just nice and clean and crisp. But yeah, the main thing is your sound. Like you want to make sure that you sound really good. There isn't echoes bouncing off the walls, or your mic isn't like way too far away and you can't hear yourself. And even just that your equipment is compatible with the recording platform too.
I think it also is kind of a little secret cheat code for hosts too. You don't have to insist that your guest will use the right recording equipment if you could just check yourself on a pre-call. I think it's good for that. So going back to the content of it all, how does a pre-call help in identifying potential topics and questions that might come up in an interview?
So yeah, pre-call is really good for that. You're going to discuss like each other's expertise to start with, which will then lead to you're discussing which topics are good. It goes back to that, what can you bring to the audience? So it's what topics, like you might have a list of topics as long as your arm, but that's not necessarily like they're not all going to hit perfectly with the target audience or with the show's audience. So you want to make sure that you're navigating like and being humble as to what the host finds valuable. You might also have some topics that the host has covered recently. They might not have aired yet, or they might have, but they're not going to want to repeat of the same thing. So it might be best to find like for any of our clients, we provide one sheets that have suggested topics, but maybe those topics don't fit into what the host is looking to talk about. So you have that discussion of, okay, well, I know you are an expert in this and this, A and B, A and C, but how about we find some middle ground and we talk about B? And it can bring forward more in-depth conversations as well. The host will know what topics you feel comfortable with. They can then go do some extra digging and find those questions that really are thought-provoking and are different to any other conversation you've had with another host.
I've always said one of my biggest pet peeves is when I'm listening to a podcast and the guest will say a swear word and then they go, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Can I swear?" That drives me crazy because if you did your research, you should have known whether or not you're allowed to swear on that show. And it's just another way that a pre-call can really alleviate that, because then we don't have to ask on camera if we're allowed to do that. But I digress. So as a client account manager, obviously you've dealt with clients who have been on guests on podcasts and have done pre-calls. So could you provide any examples of how a pre-call has improved the quality of a podcast interview?
Yeah, so at Interview Valet, we always promote welcome pages and find them really beneficial for our clients. I've had clients who have gone into the pre-call so well prepared that they've shown the host their welcome page, and the host has then been like, "Oh, great. Not only are they excited, they have already maybe started promotion, maybe talking about like, oh, I'm going to talk to this host next week. I can't wait." But if they show them the welcome pages, I've had clients where they've come out of a pre-call and the host has started wanting to work with them before the interview ever happens. Um, they're like, "Oh, I looked at your calls to action on your welcome page. I downloaded that free PDF that you offered. I read through it. I think we can work together on a more professional or an even more professional basis, not just in podcasting, outside of it here as well." So it can be really beneficial in that way. Also, it alleviates any of that kind of the coldness. It starts that conversation, or even as simple as you just mentioned, to let them know whether they are comfortable to use more colorful language to emphasize their point, or whether they should stick totally family friendly.
And Louise mentioned welcome pages. For more information on welcome pages, check out the podcast interview marketing episode with Tiffany and Jessica, where we discuss turning passive listeners into active leads.
Yes, very good.
So everything with the guest, we got a good idea for. What about the host? The host has to also do more than just show up to a pre-call. So what do you think are good ways that they can prepare?
Yeah, so like hosts have, yes, it's their show, it's their domain, but there's a certain etiquette as well that when it comes to a pre-call or an interview in general, you should have read through their one sheet if they have one, or looked up their website, see what they do. You should also know how to pronounce their name. If their name, yeah, if their name is anything slightly out of the ordinary, it's not, Mr. Smith or Mrs. Jones, like, just look it up. There's most of the people that are going on as podcast guests, they they might not have done podcasting before, but I can bet you they've done some sort of video before on their LinkedIn or on their website where they introduce themselves and they say their own name, or somebody else references them. Make sure you're pronouncing their name right. Make sure you know their business name correctly. Like, it's basic etiquette to have done a little bit of research beforehand. It doesn't have to be like tons, but a little bit of research will always not only make the guest feel more comfortable, but it will show your eagerness, and which will make them be more eager. The more eager everybody is, the more everybody promotes, the more it leads to listeners and really thought-provoking conversations as well.
I would also say it's just important to remember that every call is a meeting in a sense. It's a way to forge a business relationship. So there's a lot to be. A guest can get a lot out of a pre-call too. That it's not just a good interview. That could be a whole new lead or a whole new business relationship that you could work with. So I love it. So what are some tools or platforms you would recommend for conducting pre-calls? We're very fond of Riverside here, but what else have you worked with?
Ideally, your pre-call would be using the same platform that you plan on recording with, because then you know that the spec and the tech and everything is set up, ready to go. You just need to emulate that for the final interview. You see, you've got Riverside, you've got your Zoom, obviously. Google Meets can be great, but I find it takes up so much more bandwidth that you're more likely to have lagging problems. StreamYard is another great one. There's so many different recording platforms out there. But yeah, any occasion that I've used Riverside, I've now used it as a host and as a guest. It's been really smooth. It's been really simple to use. And like that with we all use Zoom all the time. It's great. So it can be handy because everybody can feel more comfortable with it. But I'm not sure if it gets the best audio quality.
And what about tools? What do you think are some good tools that people should use? Not just even for pre-calls, for interviews in general.
Like if you use a note taker and that can be invited into the call, that's great because not only, I don't know about you, but as soon as I get off a call, I'm like, what did I say or what?
Yeah. Forget absolutely everything. Oh, me
Absolutely
too.
everything.
Yeah.
It's like, I know I promised to follow up in an email with some action items. What in the world were those action items? So, you've got the likes of Fireflies, you've got Otter AI. Those are some great note-taking and note-taking softwares and platforms, but they're also really good for if you can do them on the interview as well. They'll transcribe everything, so you can refer back to the conversation when you start to do that early promotion before the episode goes live. You can also it's a backup audio. Sometimes things go wrong, so it's backup audio that you've recorded. Now, obviously, you don't want to release anything until the host has made the episode go live. It is their show, but it is a good backup. And I know Tom has had experience where he's recorded, and the host was like, oh no, like all the files are lost. I don't know what to do. And he was like, well, rather than have the conversation again and it not flow as naturally, I've got the recording. So here you go.
Lifesaver. Look at that, using tools. So how can a pre-call help in tailoring the content of the podcast to suit the target audience better? It's kind of tricky with moving parts of both the host and the guest, but a pre-call can help with that, can it?
For sure. So you might have a set list of topics you want to talk about, but realistically, you're an expert in your field. You're not. I can only talk about this scripted conversation that I have pre-prepared.
Mm-hmm.
If that is the case, then you are not an expert in your field and you need to do some more research. But realistically, the people that are going on as podcast guests, they know so much more than the 5 topics that they have written down on their one sheet. So the host might have recently covered one of your topics, or the host might be like, you're great about talking about this, this, and this, but have you ever thought about talking about this? So it's more, the host knows their audience. They know what the audience want to hear. They know what route they want to go down. You don't want to come to like a fork in the road in your conversation and the host wants to go right, but you only can focus on left. So it allows that bit more, that bit of time as well in between the pre-call and the actual interview for you to go back and make sure that you do have your points on the topic they cover. You've refreshed that information that you already know, but you've refreshed it so that you've got new examples maybe, or you remember the stories that you use in order to explain your point. It can be really helpful in that way. I know one of my clients, I adore his preparation. He's always so good. But he'll go back and he'll be like, oh, I've written these 3 books. I know they're going to ask me about questions on it. I need to refresh myself on the stories that are mentioned in that book that are used as examples of my point. And if you know the topic in advance, or you know the angle that the host wants to go with, then he can go back and go, okay, that's a story from book number 2, but I haven't revised that in a while. So let me go back and read that the day before.
It can also help with topical, like current events too. But something could happen in between booking the pre-call and the pre-call that could completely change the trajectory of a topic. I've seen that happen with some of my clients too. So that also is really helpful. It's a little fine line right in the middle there that I think really helps.
Yeah, and like so podcasting has changed so much since the pandemic, and we always encourage our clients to like pick topics that are evergreen topics, but nobody saw the pandemic happening and nobody saw how it would affect podcasting shut up, because everybody had more time. It was easy to buy a mic, buy some headphones, you were in your home already, set up yourself a little studio, and go. Could you imagine if you had a pre-call and then a week later it was a pandemic?
I know that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking of, I had a client who had a lot of health topics, and then when COVID hit, he pivoted completely into research about that, and it worked because of that. So pre-calls are good. What follow-up actions from the pre-call? So we're talking in between the pre-call and the official interview. What action should be taken to ensure everything goes well on the official interview?
I would say, first of all, it's always great to be polite. Message each other, be like, thanks, that was great. I can't wait. I'm so looking forward to our call, our interview next week. It's just good manners. It's really nice. It continues the established relationship. Do your research, refresh yourself on your topics, make sure that it's all front of memory, and that you haven't forgotten bits and pieces. One thing I always suggest from my clients, especially like if they're using welcome pages, in an interview, you can be surprised at how quickly your mind goes blank. So if you have a welcome page link, write it on a post-it, have it sitting right beside your camera, so that when they ask you, where should people find you, you have it there and you don't misspell it, or you don't mix up which show you're on because you're panicking trying to like spell out your website with the URL at the end. I know one of our great hosts, Mary Lou, always, like in her show prep notes, is always suggest having your glass of water beforehand or having it by your side so that your vocal cords are all warmed up. We don't expect you to be doing full-blown scales, but making sure that you're comfortable, you're not feeling really groggy, and make sure your tech is set up. Make sure your setup is still looking good, still sounding good. If you have to move, because I know, look, a lot of our guests and our clients, they travel a lot for work. If you have to do that, make sure that you are either in like a really, really, really quiet hotel room, but ideally try and make it look like it's not a hotel room, or you've rented a conference room. You want to make sure that in between that, the host doesn't go, they looked great last week. What happened?
I also think there is a lot to be gained from asking for feedback, both from the guest and the host. There's nothing wrong. Again, it goes back to being humble, like you've said a few times. You could ask them how you could improve, whether it's the host or the guest. I mean, there's a very tactful way to do it versus a not. Tread lightly. If you're not the kind of person that can handle that sort of confrontation, maybe consider not doing that. But I think confrontation can be good, and I think feedback is always constructive if it's given constructively. So I would also throw that out there for anyone interested.
Yeah, there's totally a way to give constructive feedback and it to be well received if you are like being polite and you're actually just looking to improve things. You're not just looking to nitpick.
Well, I think that's great. Well, thank you so much, Louise. I have learned a lot. You gave me some tips I never even thought of, and I know our audience really enjoyed it too.
Thank you very much, Chloe. And Look forward to continuing working with you.
So there you have it, pre-calls. Next time you get invited to a show and the host wants to do a pre-call, now you know everything that's going to go on there. Don't look at it as an extra commitment of time. Look at it as an extra opportunity for you to connect with that influencer, that micro influencer of that audience that you want to talk directly to.